Minford, a sort of academic sword and shield of the Brexiteers. Good morning to you, Professor.
Good morning, John.
Now, you are in a very buoyant mood about Brexit, aren't you? You're saying not only is there nothing to fear, but it's going to shower this country with a bounty of maybe £65 billion a year. Now, how optimistic is that? Does that assume, for example, that there will be a free trade deal with the EU, at least as good as the one we have now?
No, it doesn't. Well, actually, in the sort of main forecast we make, we do assume a free trade deal, but we do another one where we assume no free trade deal. And actually, it's a better one because we start earlier. We leave the EU promptly in 2019 March and go straight into our free trade policies and our policies of taking back our own regulation.
Yes.
And so that's actually better, in fact, though that isn't our main forecast.
Yeah, well, so we could end up with no deal in our negotiations with the European Union, and that would be, if anything, even more of a golden future. Could you just maybe square that for us with what some people, like the leaders of the CBI, say when they talk about substantial loss of jobs and investment if there is no deal with the European Union? And you'd think they would know.
Well, they are actually the representatives of industry that will face more competition, which is the point, really, of Brexit. It is to bring more competition to the economy by bringing free trade with the rest of the world, which the EU keeps out. So, of course, the CBI would say that, and it's perfectly natural, but it isn't the truth.
Because you say they simply fear competition, that they're just guarding their own and feathering their own nest.
Well, I'm afraid that's true, because manufacturing is protected by 20% by the EU, and so if we get rid of that, of course, it means prices for these manufacturing industries do come down in the long run by 20%. And then, of course, in the short run, they're doing well because of the Brexit devaluation. So they really ought to take advantage of that to bring up their productivity long term. And that will, of course, benefit the economy. That's the whole point of Brexit, really, to bring competition to the economy and raise productivity.
But this is not too rosy then, because when you look at, let's take car makers, the car makers of the northeast of this country. If we end up with no deal at all, they could be facing tariffs on the sale of their cars, on the import of the components for the cars that they are making. It will put up their costs. It will suppress their margins. It could affect, couldn't it, Patrick, their investment decisions and their employment levels.
Well, we've looked at the car industry, and of course it's doing frightfully well. As you know, manufacturing is surging at the moment on the basis of the Brexit devaluation. And that's an important bonanza in the short run to get them to invest in the longer run in higher productivity. Of course, most of our car industry...
But they could just pull up and start setting up operations on the other side of the channel for the sake of saving money.
Well, not really, because what we see is that 60% of our car exports go outside the EU at the moment. And they are world beaters, actually, this car industry. So I don't worry about them at all.
Well, that still leaves 40%. That's really quite a large number.
Well, 40% is a large number. But, of course, you see, if they raise productivity, and they obviously can, because if they're selling to the rest of the world 60% of their output, why can't they sell at the same prices, the 40%? And, of course, they can. And that's the whole point. I mean, no one is saying they won't lose jobs because they'll raise productivity. That's the point. This idea that the economy is damaged because you get more competition is obvious nonsense, because we rely on competition to raise productivity and create more jobs in the long run by raising wages. So that's a nonsense argument the CBI is using.
Yeah, they seem very sincere when they make the argument, but that's obviously your view. What about banks? What about the City of London and the financial institutions who say that when they're, because it seems a fair bet, when they're deprived of the passporting rights, the right to freely trade financial services across Europe, which exists at the moment and could well cease in their present form at least when we leave the European Union, that will affect their investments and the billions, the tens of billions, the hundreds of billions that brings into the British economy.
Well, again, this is a complete canard, because the city relies on its enormously high prestige as the number one world financial center because it sells all around the world. It's the most competitive industry we have, actually, and it relies to a modest extent on the EU, which the EU, of course, relies on the city. And the idea that the EU is going to be protectionist towards the city by denying it the sort of equivalence, which is the equivalent of passporting for those outside the EU, that it gives to all the other countries of the world, including the US, of course, and the other major centers, this is nonsense. And of course, if they do, the city will simply sell elsewhere. It's not a problem for them. I mean, they're not protected. They live on their wits in the world market, and the world market won't change.
I suppose there must be many people in Germany who'd quite like the city to be the city of Frankfurt, but we can take that one off. Anthony Selden, you look sceptical, and that's the understatement of the year.
Patrick, I'd love to believe you, but listening to you, it just reminds me that economics is often guided by emotion first. Economists reach their conclusions through emotion and then find the facts to build their case. Now, so let's look at some facts. Britain was the quickest growing economy in the G8. In 2016, when we had the referendum vote, we were the fifth largest economy in the world. I mean, how much better is it going to be under your marvellous Brexit? Are we going to be first of the first? Are we going to be first, strongest power in the whole world, Patrick? I mean, what was so awful about this EU that you so despise and have denigrated? How much better is it going to be? Tell us, because a lot has hinged on the advice that you have given and the economic forecasts.
Well, yes, a good question, Anthony. I mean, the thing is that we're looking not at a race with the rest of the world. We're looking at improving UK's performance. And free trade is a potent way of doing that. I mean, that's actually has been traditionally our way over the centuries to build the UK economy, free trade. And getting back to free trade from the protectionism of the EU is at the heart of improving our performance. And the other thing is, of course, the EU's regulation. It's very intrusive, and we have calculated that it has quite a damaging effect on our GDP. And we can get away from that and produce our own pragmatic regulation. And the third thing, of course, is control of our borders, where we give, at the moment, a 20% wage subsidy to all EU unskilled workers, which is a complete nonsense and damaging to our own citizens. And, of course, finally, there's the money we pay for all this, which is an expensive amount to pay for something that's a negative. So I think it's not that we're against the EU in principle, and I take all your points about talking to them in terms of NATO and, common security policies and all the rest of it. We want to be friends with the EU, but we don't want to be governed by them. And this is what this has all been about improving our economic performance by getting to our own systems of democratic government.
Jessica?
Thanks, John. I was interested in what you said about taking back our own regulation and what that means for UK consumers. Liam Fox has came out last week and said he admitted himself he didn't think that a lowering of safety standards would be something that UK consumers would accept, even if it meant lowering prices. So if we were to lower our regulations to have the same sort of safety standards on children's toys as China does, toys would be cheaper. But I can't see UK parents accepting that as the right price to pay. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't think it's got anything to do with it, because no one's proposing lowering standards. The EU's non-tariff barriers are discriminatory application of standards to keep out particular, foreign producers. And that's a different thing from having general standards, which, of course, we share in general. The point is that how you run your trade policy should be on a non-discriminatory basis. You get rid of non-tariff barriers. You don't put an anti-dumping duty on Chinese crockery, as the EU does at the moment, completely illogically from our point of view. And so it goes on. It's about anti-dumping duties. It's about discriminatory use of standards to keep up particular products. That's what non-tariff barriers are. No one's talking about lowering standards in general. We continue to have our own standards, and they're very similar to the EU's in principle. It's simply the application of them in the trade context is importantly has to be non-discriminatory.
Okay, got to move on. Patrick Minford, thanks for coming on this morning. Good to